If there is anything we have learned in the recent past, is that effective leadership matters. My next guest is an instrumental executive coach and consultant, helping leaders develop impact and wisdom. Patrick Reilly is the co-author of Managing Up.
You are watching Profonde TV with host Phyllis Haynes.
It's great to have you on the program, Patrick. I am looking forward to talking to you. You're someone who really works on what I consider the biggest challenge in our nation today, which is dealing with leaders in the 21st century.
Yes, they've made that possible, haven't they?
So despite the pandemic and all of it, you're working very hard. Can you tell me, what do you think the challenges are, in your view, for leaders today?
Well, obviously, the first thing we would look at is the pandemic, because that's changed a lot of that. And I'm guessing a lot of people have talked about that quite extensively. But my recurring experience with that is that there's three fundamentals that happen with that these days. Number one is that because of the way that people are now working, how do you get a team of people to connect well now when you can't have coffee, you can't go out to lunch, that sort of stuff? And that's something I hear a lot. And the surprising thing about that to me is that I'm not necessarily hearing it from the boss, but the boss is telling me about it from the people on her or his team. So that rings my bell a bit. Second thing is the pandemic, and these are problems that were there before as challenges, but I think they've gotten exemplified, they've grown, they're more salient now. The other two would be, how do I grow the business? Now, clearly there are people like Zoom and Peloton and hardware stores who've profited from the pandemic. But for other people, it's been a tough go, right, to grow their business. The third thing, again, always a challenge if you're in a product business in particular. How do you innovate? How do you get a group of people to build a new product now? Like, for example, we're chatting on Zoom right now. Zoom was developed mostly by people who used to work at WebEx. They took what they learned from that company and they've built something that's now a better product that many of us are using all the time. So those are the generic challenges, if you would. I also think there's a lot of challenge now with managing people of different ages and generation. Given who I work with, which is primarily more senior leaders, what I hear the most about are those Gen Z people. And they can't quite get them to do things in the way they're used to. They don't know how to motivate them, that sort of stuff. So, but I think it's around a range of ages. And then also in a lot of places. Now, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and one of the things in and around Silicon Valley is you have an extreme diversity of people. And so sometimes managing the cultural differences is really a big challenge for folks. Someone who, for example, a typical thing is often I work with a lot of technical people who are raised in China and India. And often a cultural value is being humble, even if you're really, really good. And that is the antithesis of what leaders are asked to do in Silicon Valley, which is tell me what a rock star you are, why what you're doing is way better than what anybody else is doing. So those are the basics. Let me see if I think of anything that, two other generic things, Phyllis, I think just we've heard about for a long is just the speed of change that we have to deal with, and also the volume of information and the way it grows these days. It's just, even for really, really smart people, that's a lot to keep up with. The last thing I would think about, I'm sorry, you're going to say something.
Well, I just wanted to ask you, has the role of the leader changed? So, for example, many of the people I've interviewed over the years were used to working with executives who came out of the military structure. Yes. You know, the CEOs were the guys who flew the jet planes or ran the military services and then transferred into corporate life. Are the leaders different also now? And are they coming from a different place in your view?
Yes and no, right? There are still some traditional organizations where what you just talked about is the model or the MO. However, when you get a range of people in terms of age and cultural diversity and orientation, one size does not fit all. So it requires a leader to be much more flexible in terms of thinking about, how do I engage with her? How do I engage with him? How do I engage with them? And to me, the only people who really make it up to the most senior levels are ones who really learn how to interact successfully with a diverse group of stakeholders. So yes, it's the world we live in is quite different. And so the leaders who are from, I'll say, more emerging organizations have to be pretty different. So yes,
Yeah.
most of the time.
There used to be more of a hierarchical structure of leadership where leaders would, talk about what needs to be done. But then there came this idea of management by walking around. I think that was Tom Peters in the old days. So now, given that we're on Zoom, is there a phrase for the kind of leadership we need to do now? It's not hands-on for sure.
Well, I think it has to do with a lot of inclusivity. And how do I connect and engage with a wide range of people? Interesting thing, a good old friend of mine, his name is Doug Kirkpatrick. Doug, I refer to him as the king of tomato paste. And the reason I do is that he ended up leaving law school and got a job working for a company in the Central Valley in California. That was the first company to manufacture tomato paste in the United States. Actually, didn't manufacture. They are the people who put it together and package it for those that we buy from the store. And that was one of the first real experiments where there were leadership, was almost a totally flat organization, and everyone had the same possibilities, the same ability to make decisions, and they became extremely profitable and very successful company. But not everyone has adopted that, and not everyone is going to go that way. So, but I think there's more and more more organizations are moving more in that way because of the nature of the people, greater independence that people have, a better feeling. Even if I'm 22 years old, when I take a look at Silicon Valley, you've got a zillion leaders there who are 25 years old running big organizations. So it changes things. Now, on the other hand, there is something that people need to learn in order to manage others successfully and then to lead others successfully. And sometimes that just takes some time in the saddle and enough repetitions to learn how to do things, because some of it is trial and error. Some of it is learning from watching others who are successful and engaging with a diverse range of people. So there's a lot of opportunity. In fact, in particular, I do a lot of work with sort of younger emerging leaders to help them sort of tune up and learn some things that they need to learn to sort of get to the next level. But that's just me, not everyone necessarily.
How would you describe your style of working? What would you say? Are you a person who cracks the whip? Are you someone who has a mentoring style? How would you describe your methodology?
Well, I find that most people get better and can change how they behave if you're respectful towards them. You are compassionate and understand some of the challenges and problems they have, but you always have to, or I always find that you have to ask them, what are the goals they have? What are the results they need to get, both in terms of their business deliverables, and two terms I use regularly and consistently are, as a leader, what do you have to do to generate both success and satisfaction? Because clearly the bosses above you are looking for business success, right? They're looking for numbers and deliverables, product, etc. Satisfaction is around what's it like to work with you? What do people say about you? And most importantly, will they follow you, right? And so sometimes that requires me to be tough with them. So I'm not averse to that. Sometimes you have to say, look, if you don't pay attention to this, things are not going to work out. In fact, let me give you an example of a gentleman I worked with a number of years ago. He was a killer salesperson, and everybody wants a killer salesperson. Worked for a tech company, big tech company, you would know the name. He developed a specific expertise in an industry vertical. And guess what? His old boss from company one recruited him because he knew he could deliver, he could sell, and he knew about something that the new company needed. He got himself in a big passel of trouble, which is how I got invited in, because two things. One is, the company where you worked before, when you were executive vice president, you figured out what to do. You told people and you did it. He moved to a company where it was much more of, now you had to sell all of your ideas to your peer EVPs. It was much more consensus based. And he went crazy because what he had learned to do no longer worked, right? And one day I had this conversation with him, and I'll never forget this, because we were meeting at the airport Hilton in O'Hare. No, excuse me, Marriott. Pardon myself, Marriott. And we were eating at the bar, restaurant, chatting. And he looks at me and he says, "You mean," I'm going to delete some of the words he actually used in the conversation. It wouldn't be appropriate. But you understand, "You mean to tell me blank, 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 that you've talked to all these people, you've had me do all these assessments, we've done all this work, and all I need to do is talk to my people like I speak to my wife and daughter." And we went around this 3 times, and I said, "Yes." I said, "And I've seen you and I've heard you speak to your wife and daughter. And if you learn to speak to your people in that way and still get results, your world will change." Now, his face, and I'll have to say, I'll insert this here because this is my memory. Now, you have to understand, this gentleman, he's African American. Mm-hmm. What I remember is his face turning red, like totally bright red. Now, is that possible? I don't think so, but that's what I remember. So this is the essence of the situation, right? And he looks at me, and for a moment, I thought he was going to try to strangle me across the table. And then he goes, "You're not kidding, are you?" And I said, "No, I'm not." And his world changed. So does that answer your question about my style?
It does, but not, that leaves a lot of questions for people who are listening, because, we have the Jackie Gleason model of how he spoke to his wife. I don't think you mean that, or the Desi Arnaz model of how he spoke to Lucy.
I'm sorry. So, thank you for clarifying that. No, he was sweet. He listened. He asked questions, and he was curious. And then, as a result of that, he set clear expectations around what he was going to do and what he expected of them. But it was done in a very respectful manner. So it worked. So thank you for that. But yes.
Yeah, I'm glad you cleared that up.
Not that model, but yes.
So you have embraced embedded in your answers is the changing landscape of the workplace.
Yes.
That there's so much diversity, and I've worked in this field myself. There's so much incredible diversity, not only in terms of ethnicity, but in terms of style and expectations.
Yes.
So when we get a chance to go back into the office, is that something you want to do? Or are you wanting to continue this remote relationship? Some people I've talked to want to keep doing it remotely because they love this, not having to get on an airplane.
I have 2 answers to that. One is, in a pragmatic sense, I used to spend a lot of my time in a car or sometimes on an airplane. I don't have to do that anymore. So that saves me a lot of time, money, and anguish. It's nothing like having to get to a meeting and you're standing there and the plane's delayed 3 hours, or you get stuck behind a car and what sometimes is a half-hour drive is 2 hours. and after a while, there's only so much productivity you can do on the phone in the car, right? So that's a piece of it. Um, and I find I connect pretty well with people in this way. And I've done a lot of work to do that. I've gotten some training from some people about how to do that. In fact, you actually had me adjust my camera a little bit before we started today, given your background, so people could see a little more of me, right?
Right.
On the other hand, just like many of my clients, there is something that is just not quite the same when you connect with people this way. There is something about seeing someone live, in person, getting a feel for them that is just better and is more satisfying to most of us. Not all of us, but there's something about that that I really enjoy. So, but then it becomes a question of, risk reward and balancing your time and your investments, if you would. So
Let's take on a couple of specific problems.
sure.
There are people right now inside the workplace who lobby for discussing the political environment inside the workplace.
Yes.
What's your recommendation for leaders who seem backed up against a wall with how much of the outside world should we let into the inside world? Or maybe the question is a little flawed. You can come back at me with that.
Well, let me say this. It's a very difficult, delicate question to answer as a starting point. And there is no one answer, one size fits all. You asked me to think about that question before we talked. And as I was reflecting on it, what came into my mind was thinking, in the last couple of years, I've done a lot of work at a big construction company. And I also do a lot of work in biotech companies. And so I thought about the two of them as opposite ends of the continuum in terms of the business that people do and some of the concerns and the constraints that you have in each of those businesses. So the first thing is, what's the business I'm running? That begins to help me think about that. Second thing is, I'm pretty inclined to use with a lot of clients to come up with mental models or constructs to help people think about what they're going to think about in a more structured, organized way, so we're not reinventing the wheel every time. So I was thinking about your question, and the model that came to mind for me is a number of things. One is, think about myself as leader. What are the good behaviors that I want to engage in and display to set an example for the people in my organization? So that's a piece of a way to begin to look at it. Second thing is around, what are the values of our organization, and what do they suggest in terms of us managing politics inside and outside the organization? And what's the culture in our organization? Because different organizations have different values and cultures that run behind the scenes. The third thing that is part of the model I think about this with is something I used to use with my kids, but also use, which is, what is it about conversations that should be public and what should be private, right? And private can be within Slack, with a tool that probably most of your listeners would know about, that we use to communicate inside the organization. What becomes public, and what do we talk about outside the organization? And then the last thing that came to mind for me, Phyllis, is really, and I don't know where this came from, but it's really, the physician's credo is around do no harm. So how do you permit people to engage in that kind of discussion, but think about the behaviors, the values, the culture? What do you do publicly? What do you privately? And how do you have discussions about politics inside the organization that doesn't do harm to others within the company and or damage the brand or the reputation of your organization outside in the world? So for me, if I'm sitting and running an organization, I start to think about those things, and that mental model helps me to create the approach that I would work with. And then the last thing I would say is this. I have a tendency to think about things, for some reason, in Venn diagrams. Don't ask me why. And God bless some of my high school math teachers. Okay. Thank you
Just
for
for the listener to understand, the Venn diagram are those things with circles that you see circles intersecting or
yes.
overlapping. Those are
Yeah.
Venn
Right.
diagrams. Okay.
And so in this context, it's what do we put as private conversation that we keep outside? What is, what is public conversation? And then the definition, if you would, and how I would take the model that I create as the leader of the company is what is it and how do we do it to create a safe, bounded space to talk about these things inside our organization.
That's great. I probably would push back a little bit with you today and say, um, to think of what is private today is different than maybe 10 years ago. I think that we don't have the luxury of privacy. So there need to be policies on the use of social media and external expression so that employees know what their limits are or boundaries are. But I love your idea that you would allow conversation, but with some concern for the well-being of others in the company. So I think that's a powerful answer.
Yeah, and let me restate, and for the reputation and the brand of the organization in the public setting, right? Because I think both are required.
Okay, well, as we begin to wrap this up, let me ask you, you got into this work because you had a vision for helping leaders make a better impact.
Yes.
What's your vision? I know this is a big question, but what's your vision for leaders in the United States and in the world? Because they're actually, many of our leaders are global, truly. What's your vision for them? What do you see for the future?
Well, it's a tough job if you want to take it, right? However, those who lead get to make the final choice, and many of us like to be the person. Not everyone does, but many of us like to be the person who gets to make the final choices. And so, where I go with that is this: you're only a good leader if you have people who are willing to follow you, right? And what makes people follow you? So people will follow me as leader if I have a picture or vision of something that's attractive, that's a stretch, but is doable, right? And that, I want to go work for her because that's something I want to work with. That's something I want to work on. That's something I want to work towards. And behind that for me are two things that I think a lot about. And it's part of the approach that I take with my clients. And these are maybe words that you've not heard before, but I think about two distinct things, which is leaders now need to have two things, what I call leadership muscle and wisdom. So leadership muscle, just like you're in the gym working out, you have to have the courage, the stamina to make good, well-informed choices. And you have to have the wisdom to see forward and to see around corners in our VUCA-like world. People are may or may not be familiar with that phrase. VUCA, V-U-C-A, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. That is the world we are in today. So if you don't think you can handle playing in that world, you shouldn't be leading an organization today. So you have to.
Let's do VUCA one more time.
Sure. VUCA, volatile. That's the V. U, uncertain. C, complex. A, ambiguous. And our world was like that before COVID-19. This is just amped up the VUCA-ness, if that's a word, that makes it a little tougher to work with. So my picture is, if you want to play in that world, go out and develop your muscle and your wisdom, your leadership muscle, and the wisdom to make informed choices about difficult subjects and have a pretty high batting average.
Well, let me say this to you. I can tell you from years of interviewing that there is an enormous isolation and pain that leaders feel at the top. And it's tremendously important for leaders and potential leaders to have a mentor and have access to someone who can guide them through what you now are calling the VUCA. I'm going to keep that. That's wonderful. But who are guiding them through the challenges of the world that they're in.
Mhm.
So I really thank you. Is there anything you want to add, Patrick?
Well, one, thank you very much for inviting me to chat with you. Two, obviously, I love to talk about this subject, and I think it is really important. And the last thing I would say is just for myself and for the leaders that I work with, this is an evolving subject that it's not a done deal. The packaging is there now, but we'll have to unwrap and keep moving because the world is changing. If you take a look just at the last year and a half, a good friend of mine from Colorado said here's 5 core crises that have occurred in terms of racial issues, politics, pandemic. I can't remember the rest of them off the top of my head. So that's a lot to handle. And so we have to keep developing ourselves to become better leaders and more informed participants on the planet. Climate change, that's the other one. Okay, sorry, I forgot that. It's only
climate change and safety inside the organization, because
Yes.
we've had all of these shootings. So those are the 5. I definitely think you're right.
So that's what I would add is just, but hey, if you want to be a full player and participant in this game of being a human being, that's part and parcel of what you got to do, right? Nothing's free.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Patrick.
My pleasure.
And there will be a way for people to find you. I know that you're on LinkedIn. That's how I found you.
Yes.
But also that you come well spoken of by several people I know. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to chat with you.